Well, thank you all for coming here today. My name's Josh, and along with Julia, I'm one of the co-seminars here at Calleva-Airey Global Security Seminar. And what a week it's been for global security. It's almost pretty hard to keep up, because we are seemingly living through one of the most dangerous and exciting times in modern history. The global order is not simply under pressure, it is being reconfigured by force. We are not living through a single crisis, but through a polycrisis. Wars in Europe and the Middle East, looming confrontation in East Africa, ecological destabilization, technological volatility, fraying alliances, and ideological fragmentation. These aren't isolated events, they're converging and accelerating. The war in Ukraine continues to grind forward. Israel and Iran appear to be in a state of all-out war. North Korea rattles its arsenal. And Xi Jinping, now 70 and facing demographic collapse in China, may see this as the final viable window to move on Taiwan. Francis Fukuyama's history did not end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, so the future may increasingly resemble the past. Disparate regimes, monarchies, and technocracies vying for control in a contested multipolar world. Beneath great power competition lies deeper systemic transformation, what I call quantum stratification, a continuous, irreversible form of human inequality emerging from differential access to advanced technologies, fragmenting future societies into radically divergent castes of existence. It is the quiet revolution, and it will outlast this decade's wars and reshape global security in ways we are not prepared for. At the same time, we are witnessing the collapse of epistemic integrity, society's ability to agree on shared facts. Without it, democracies stumble, institutions drift, and strategy becomes incoherent. It is clear then, if we do not shape the world will shape us, and not on terms of our choosing. This means rearming, not just militarily, but morally and intellectually. It means recommitting to alliances and recovering a sense of agency, the belief that what we do matters and that history has not ended. The moment is perilous, but it is also thrilling. It is a once-in-a-century chance to shape the future, with the next 100 years still up for grabs. This is the spirit in which the Calleva-Neave Global Security Seminar series was founded, to take national security education seriously, to elevate scholarship into strategy, and to inspire the best minds to enter the arenas where they can have the greatest impact. And today, we are joined by one of the most compelling and influential voices on modern conflict and strategy, Professor David Kilcullen. David has uniquely bridged the worlds of theory, strategy and operations, business, academia, and technology. He served as chief strategist at the US State Department during the Iraq surge, senior counterinsurgency advisor to General Petraeus in Baghdad, and later advised General McChrystal in Afghanistan. He has shaped national strategy at the highest levels whilst keeping his boots firmly on the ground. He is the author of The Accidental Guerrilla, Counterinsurgency, Out of the Mountains, Blood Year, and Dragons and the Snakes, books that have fundamentally shaped how we understand modern war, inspiring generations of national security professionals. He's been called the rock star of counterinsurgency, and rightly so. No one has a better finger on the pulse of how conflict is evolving. He's admired by elbow patch-wearing academics, as he is by special operators and policymakers. He's a soldier, scholar, technologist, a genre in and of itself. Few can speak with such authority about the past 20 years of conflict, and fewer still about what comes next. So the scene is set, the hype tree is over. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Kilcullen.
That was a very impressive introduction, mate. I'm actually extremely delighted to be here, partly because Josh and I have been nearly a year trying to pull this together. So I'm really happy that I was able to finally get here by piggybacking on the back of the RUSI Land Warfare Conference, which is happening this week in London. And Jack Watling, who some of you may know, asked me to come and speak on a panel. So that gave me the great excuse to get up to Oxford and hang out with all of you guys. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to use slides. We can talk to them if we need to later. What I want to do is just lay out a few big ideas over about 20 minutes, hopefully offend, slant, provoke you guys enough that we can get into a lively discussion. And then we've got basically until Julia tells us we're out of time to kick those ideas around. So for me, the first few minutes is really just setting the scene so that we can get to that discussion. So I want to talk about 4 trends that I think are worth watching. 2 of them are strategic, 1 is tactical, and the final one is operational level. At the strategic level, the first big one is something that Josh just mentioned, which is what I call an accelerating transition to multipolarity. So Western defeats, which have been quite prominent in the last couple of decades, are actually being paralleled by defeats for our adversaries as well. I'll give some examples in a minute. And so rather than the West declining and being overtaken by a range of adversaries, we're seeing the emergence of a multipolar system where no one is as strong as the unipolar environment was for the 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And we're seeing a system of competing blocks and spheres of influence start to emerge. That's bad news if you're trying to prevent warfare. It's possibly good news if you're a middle power, because it opens up a lot more opportunities for agency than we've previously experienced. The second big trend is a continuing worldwide collapse of confidence in elites, experts, and institutions of all kinds. If you like, a crisis of competence and legitimacy that has implications for national cohesion, for consensus reality, as Josh just mentioned, and for resilience, for our ability to handle the challenges that we've been talking about. Again, this is often described as a Western problem, but it's actually just as prominent in China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as it is in the West. So it's a worldwide pattern that's affecting all incumbents, not just us. The third trend is a tactical trend. It's the ongoing bottom-up, technologically driven transformation of warfare, where small, smart, stealthy, multi-purpose, fast, dispersed systems, and by a system I mean an organizational structure, a set of tactics, or a weapon system, are increasingly defeating large, slow, overt, single-purpose platforms. And that, again, is happening in multiple theatres at the same time. And then the final trend is a result of the first 3, and it's an operational level trend. We are seeing the emergence of new domains, new means, and new methods of warfare. And that has all kinds of implications for operational art, right? How we think about campaigning and conducting conflict. So to start off with the first one, the transition to multipolarity. Not long ago, there was quite a hot debate between people who expected China to inevitably overtake the United States and thought that the best thing to do was figure out how to make our peace with that. So you might call those people accommodationists, just for shorthand. And then there were other people who believed that a Western-led world order could be preserved effectively indefinitely. So you might call those people primacists, right? People that were trying to preserve the moment of the 30 years after the end of the Cold War. Neither of those views is really playing out, right? So China, as again Josh mentioned, has some pretty severe structural, economic and demographic issues. It may get quite close to overtaking the United States, something that people sometimes describe as the Davidson window between now and about the end of 2027. But then it's going to decline in relative terms based on what we can see in the data right now. At the same time, we've obviously had our defeats in the West. Afghanistan, Iraq, I would argue that both the US and several European navies have just been defeated in the Red Sea by an actor without a navy, the Houthis. But again, our adversaries are also suffering some pretty severe defeats, right? The collapse of Syria, the destruction of Hezbollah's power base in Lebanon, the defeat of Russian private military companies in Mozambique and Mali over the past few months. And of course, Ukraine, whoever comes out technically on top, is quite likely to be a Pyrrhic victory for whoever wins that fight on points. Our adversaries are increasingly aligned and cooperating with each other. Iran, Russia, Russia, China, Iran, China, North Korea with Russia, China increasingly collaborating with the Taliban, Venezuela collaborating with Russia. All that is fairly obvious. But I think perhaps less obvious or less discussed is that what you might call swing players, so middle powers or slightly lower tier powers, are seeking greater agency. And we see this in the behaviour of Turkey, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, South Africa, many other countries in West Africa and the Sahel, and European players like Hungary, for example. A multipolar system of blocks or spheres of influence might therefore be taking shape, and something that looks more like the 1930s perhaps than the 1960s. Second big trend is this crisis of confidence, right, in elites, experts, and institutions. And I'll own from a military standpoint that a lot of this is a result of a series of defeats and a series of inconclusive outcomes in the war on terrorism, which for whatever reason, governments have been reluctant to admit. So Western populations have been told for 30 years that they have the best militaries that have ever existed on the planet. And at the same time, they see us getting our asses kicked all over the world, from Africa to Iraq to Afghanistan, or, at best achieving a draw in various conflicts. And at some point, people start to think, you so-called experts, maybe you don't know what you're talking about. And it contributes to a collapse of confidence in the legitimacy of people who style themselves as experts. But it's not just a military problem, right? You can go back to the GFC, the global financial crisis, or the Eurozone crisis, the first iteration of Black Lives Matter in the US around Ferguson, Missouri, more than a decade ago, our failure to respond effectively in Crimea, the rise of ISIS and the near destruction of the Iraqi government in 2014, 2015, the mass migration crisis that happened into Europe as a result of that and of the wars of the Arab Spring, a European terror wave that happened again following on from the mass migration crisis. Here in the UK, Brexit plus the reaction to Brexit. In the US, the election of Donald Trump and the so-called Russiagate controversies that emerged after the losing political party tried to paint President Trump as a puppet of Putin as a way of explaining their defeat to the base. We've seen right-wing populism in the US and Europe and elsewhere. Obviously, a number of allegations that the media and political elites covered up the serious cognitive decline of the most recent president, President Biden. Obviously, we've seen COVID-19, right, with controversies over the origin of the virus, over the lockdowns, over the belief by some elites that they didn't need to follow the rules imposed by those lockdowns, over the vaccine mandates, a whole bunch of other things associated with civil liberties, movement control, freedom of association that affected most Western countries. We saw, of course, the BLM 2.0, the George Floyd riots of summer of 2020, followed by January 6th in the US Capitol in January of 2021. Even things like, the fact that Boeing aircraft and spacecraft seem to be crashing a lot lately, right? Indicating that things that we might have taken for granted, the technical competence of engineering, right, companies, might not actually be as reliable as we think. Afghanistan, inflation, housing, cost of living crisis, lots of different countries having debates and arguments and even riots about border security and immigration. A lot of discussion about government censorship and media cover-ups, along with accusations of misinformation and disinformation in both directions. And then, of course, a string of political assassinations or attempted assassinations in Europe and elsewhere. I think most people are very familiar with all those things, right? And because I'm pointing the finger back at the West. But if you were to look at our adversaries, you would see things like the Arab Spring regime collapses, the Iranian democracy protests of 2009 and multiple years since, protests over the Russian elections in 2012 and subsequently. Lots of terrorist attacks in China from Uyghur and ETIM groups. Significant unrest in Venezuela and in Cuba. Multiple coup attempts, and in fact, some would argue successful coups in those countries. The democracy protests in Hong Kong, leading to the collapse of China's preferred narrative of one country, two systems. A much more severe set of disruptions as a result of COVID-19 in China and in Russia and in Iran than we actually saw in objective terms in the West. The public ejection of a previous head of the Chinese Communist Party from the 20th Party Congress in 2022, basically putting Xi Jinping's faction in the driver's seat and in control of everything, but simultaneously now meaning that anything that goes wrong is their fault, right? So leading most recently to a fairly major purge, unprecedented in Chinese history since Mao Zedong, of now tracking to about 1,500 colonels and generals across the PLA in the last 6 months. Failure of Russia's 3-day special military operation in Ukraine, which is now in its 18th month. The defeat of the Russian Navy in the northern Black Sea by an actor without a navy, similar to what we've just experienced in the Red Sea. The mutiny of the Wagner Group and the accidental death of the entire leadership group of Yevgeny Prigozhin as a result of that. Wagner's defeat at Tinzaouaten in Mali, which is probably the most severe defeat of Russian arms that we've seen any time in the last decade, but passed with almost no comment in the Western media. Things like the lying flat movement, Pingtang in China, where people are basically opting out and giving up on trying to participate in the Chinese economy or Chinese society on terms set by the Chinese Communist Party. A similar movement known as Let It Rot has been around for a little bit longer as well. And then finally, I've already mentioned demographics a couple of times, but just to mention that the Chinese military today is the largest military in history to be composed of a majority of only children as a result of the one-child policy, which makes Chinese political leaders and military commanders much more casualty averse than we might like to think, because they have to worry about what happens in terms of domestic instability if you lose a certain number of people trying to get across the Black Ditch of the Taiwan Strait. Third trend, the bottom-up transformation of warfare. I think we'll probably get into this in Q&A, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through this, but I'm just going to point to a number of things that are happening largely from the bottom up that are changing the way that war is conducted on the battlefield. So one is increasing prevalence and capabilities of long-range fires, so that the majority of the killing in most recent wars has been done by very, very long-range missile systems, long-range artillery, drones, missiles from over the horizon, or airstrikes. So very small teams on the ground, very large capability coming from distant sources. The second is persistent battle space awareness. So extraordinarily deep bench of space-based and air-breathing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, giving you essentially, not perfect, but much better than ever before, visibility well into the depth area of an adversary. What my colleague Graham and I call cyberkinetic or infokinetic operations, a side effect of the emerging Internet of Things, whereby you can have a direct lethal effect on an adversary through just a cyber attack, or you can have an extraordinarily disruptive data effect on an enemy system through a purely kinetic attack. So rather than seeing cyber war and physical war as distinct from each other, we're seeing them blend in together and being used extensively as part of a single set of techniques. Talked about ISR already, but distributed ISR, so lots of small teams forward, is being complemented by cooperative engagement capabilities, so that you have the controller, the shooter, and the sensor for a weapon system offset from each other, in some cases by hundreds of miles, so that it's no longer possible to target fully an adversary system because it's now decoupled from geography. The effects that you are having on the battle space don't necessarily require you to be present on site when you're carrying out those effects. Ubiquitous technical surveillance. So the continuous, pervasive, ongoing, distributed collection, dissemination, processing of data from multiple different sources simultaneously, conducted by government but also by commercial entities and civil society, happening in near real time, distributed with very little quality control, and making it more or less impossible for you to be truly covert or clandestine in your operations. So that the best you can usually hope for is delayed attribution. And you may think, well, it might take a microsecond or two for enemy sensor systems to pick me up. It might take a few minutes to an hour or two for adversary intelligence officers to figure out what's happening. And then it might take days to weeks for enemy political leaders to actually get organised and do something in return. So that ubiquitous technical surveillance pushes people in the direction of cognitive domain warfare, which we'll talk about in a minute, trying to affect the decision-making of adversaries rather than their ability to detect what we're doing. And the final one would be, or the final factor here would be human-machine teaming. So robotics and autonomous systems, not operating fully autonomously, but partnering with these small teams forward that I've been talking about. So when you pull all those things together, the biggest problem that I see on the ground in many of the war zones I go to and in conversations with commanders is what I call the dispersion survivability dilemma. So to summarize that, if you concentrate physically, you are creating a detectable target and you will be destroyed in seconds from people that are hundreds of miles away. But if in order to avoid that problem, you now distribute and you're much more spread out, now you have to communicate. So now you're creating an electronic target, which will again bring the same fire down on you from a distance. So people in Ukraine in particular are oscillating between wide dispersion, tight concentration, or putting really small teams, 8 to 12 guys, on the ground, supported by massive amounts of distributed firepower in order to achieve a localized effect. So when you bring all of that together, it means that long-range fires plus ISR that's distributed, plus this cooperative engagement capability, give a dispersed, invulnerable actor, like the Houthis in the Red Sea or ISR teams in Ukraine, the ability to engage targets at long range. Persistent battle space awareness and UTS reveals any maneuver en masse at scale, regardless of whether it's in the deep, close, or rear part of the battle space. Just as one illustration, the vast majority of Ukrainian units that took part in the summer 2023 offensive in Ukraine were detected, and many of them were destroyed before they'd even left the Ukrainian-controlled area and crossed the line of departure into the Russian security zone. Cyberkinetic operations plus human-machine teaming are allowing small teams with drones or USVs or UUVs to deliver stealthy, massed effects at distance. So all that generates that survivability dilemma. You're looking for the benefits of concentration without the vulnerability of mass. And different people are trying to figure out how to crack that nut right now. And then finally, and I'll stop after this, all of that gives rise to new domains, new means, and new methods of warfare. So let me talk through just a list of these and we can talk about them more in Q&A. Space and counterspace, right? Space domain is now a true warfighting domain in a way that it hasn't been before. Hypersonics, including hypersonic glide vehicles, are making many of the theatre-level ballistic missile defences around the world irrelevant to likely future strikes. Directed energy weapons, supply chain warfare, weaponisation of critical commodities, so-called chip wars, so the competition over access to semiconductors and the raw materials that enable their production. The weaponisation of energy supplies, the manipulation of migration, cognitive domain operations, that's a Chinese term, which basically means the use of cognitive attack to separate a leadership group from its own population, to divide that population, to destroy the will to resist, and to separate that population from any sources of support. Not instead of, but ahead of a kinetic engagement. We've already talked about cyberkinetic and infokinetic operations, which are increasingly sophisticated and increasingly lethal as a result of all the things we talked about. We're seeing the Arctic and the High North emerge as a much more dynamic area of multi-domain competition among the great powers. Increasingly, we're going to see the Antarctic and the sub-Antarctic in the same light because of, weirdly enough, space systems. Because all nuclear powers in history have lived in the Northern Hemisphere, for all of history, anti-nuclear or theatre ballistic missile defences have been oriented over the northern half of the globe. The Chinese in 2021 demonstrated a hypersonic glide vehicle that entered over the South Pole into the atmosphere and splashed down near the island of Hainan in the South China Sea, basically saying, hey guys, all of your theatre missile defences are now irrelevant. So we're likely to see sub-Antarctic islands become as important as places like Greenland or Iceland for global missile defences. Seabed warfare, right? Attacking communication systems, energy, commodities transport on the seabed. We can argue about who was responsible for Nord Stream. We can also argue about whether it started with Nord Stream, but I think it's pretty inarguable that norms have shifted in the last 2 or 3 years about attacking privately owned infrastructure on the seabed. And when you expand that out, I'll just use Australia as an example. The Australian economy runs on 93,000 kilometres of offshore fibre optic cable, without which the system collapses and it's basically unprotected. Because human norms were such that we didn't see these as military targets until persons unknown decided to knock out Nord Stream. Global data infrastructure, both terrestrial and orbital, is increasingly being targeted. And we're going to see space to space, as well as space to Earth and Earth to space hits coming up very shortly, I think. Targeting of electricity capacity generation, electricity generation capacity and the grid itself are increasingly part of the repertoire in modern conflict. Urban operations obviously have been around for as long as cities, but we've seen increasing emphasis on subterranean warfare in the last several years, mostly in Gaza, but not only in Gaza. There was also a very well-known battle in the Philippines in 2017, Battle of Marawi, which involved extensive subterranean manoeuvre. Multi-domain robotics and autonomous systems. So we're used to thinking about drones, but we're now seeing uncrewed surface vehicles, uncrewed underwater vehicles, seabed-based ground vehicles that crawl around under the sea, and of course, uncrewed ground vehicles in both open space and in the subterranean world. One of the mantras that you hear from commanders in the US military is no blood on first contact, meaning that the forward contact layer should be entirely composed of uncrewed systems. Then the next layer back is the human-machine teaming layer, and well back is your launch sites for all your long-range strike assets. Quantum computing, significantly affecting what sensors can do and the level of bandwidth and processing power that you need to maintain secure communications, as we've all become rather used to over the last 50 years or so. And then military AI, and we can talk a lot about what we mean by AI. 10 years ago, when people said AI, they mostly meant autonomous weapons. 5 years ago, they mostly meant robotic vehicles, self-driving vehicles. Now, when people say AI, almost always what they really mean is large language models. But actually, there's a lot more to it than that. World models, LLMs, agentic decision-making systems, the emergence of human to AI digital twins, where a commander might get killed, but his AI will survive and pass the knowledge on to the next guy. There's a whole series of these elements that are emerging rapidly across all domains. So with that, I think I've laid enough out there for us to have a bit of a conversation. But just to summarize, right, 4 big trends: transition to multipolarity, collapse of confidence in institutions, elites, and experts, affecting both us and our adversaries. They're the 2 sort of big strategic trends that I think are worth looking at. The tactical trend is that ongoing bottom-up transformation of warfare, creating that dispersion dilemma with all those different elements that we spoke about. And then finally, as a result of all of that, if you like, the expansion of the concept of warfare into a whole new series of domains: cognitive, space, cyberkinetic, and others, but also new means and new methods of warfare. And to summarise what Josh said at the beginning, that makes it an extremely interesting, not to say slightly nerve-wracking, time to be doing what we're all doing. So with that, let me throw it open to questions. Julia, I think you want to come forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating and terrifying at once. I think it will be hopefully a very interactive discussion. I'm sure you have lots of questions. I do want to start with some questions myself that came up during your talk. You've brilliantly laid out the global dynamics and trends that we're seeing. I feel like power was a word that came to mind, the power shifts that we're seeing because of these 4 trends, in particular the external kind of international relations, power reshuffle, but also the internal instability rising up against elites, the higher likelihood of fragmentation internally, but also the tech revolution. Mm-hmm. Who do you think within that whole power shifting landscape, who are the likely winners, or is that impossible to say at this point?
I think there are a number of different winners. I wrote about some of this already 5 years ago in The Dragons and the Snakes, because it was becoming very obvious then. But I think one category of winners you could call hyper-empowered non-state actors, whether they be groups or individuals, who have access to levels of lethality and precision and knowledge that you used to have to be a nation state to acquire.
So would you say Israel is a good example of this? What we've seen in the last few days was an extremely high level of sophistication in targeted attacks, as well as bigger damage being done to military.
I would actually call Israel something slightly different, because it's a state actor,
yeah.
Right? So no, I think like groups like the Houthis, who are a parastate, right?
I see. Okay, so states.
So non-state actors getting levels of lethality and precision. But you pointing to the second big winner, I think, which is states that are adopting the techniques of traditional non-state actors, right? So guerrilla, irregular, some would say terrorist techniques being repurposed, repackaged, and melded with this advanced technology to generate capabilities that you wouldn't expect from a nation state. So a good example would be Operation Spider's Web that the Ukrainians did a couple of weeks ago, which involved, months of what we call staging, right, of assets in the Russian supply chain system, and not only knocking out one leg of the Russian, damaging one leg of the Russian nuclear triad, but also putting doubt in the minds of every Russian planner and operator about the integrity of their supply chain system, right? So that's a cognitive attack as well as a physical attack. And of course, we just saw the Israelis do something a little different, but somewhat similar in Iran.
Yeah.
That's interesting, and also brings together, especially Operation Spiderweb, several of the layers that you pointed to in your presentation, whether that's supply chain operations, as well as obviously the use of drones, the use of new technologies. So is it both about the tech, the level of sophistication of tech, and the original, perhaps even innovative use of those that makes someone be successful in that shifting landscape?
Yeah, I mean, in the military innovation world, we talk about 3 key factors or drivers of innovation: technology, tactics or concepts, and organizational structures. And if you have one of the 3, you tend to get fairly limited innovation. If you have 2 together, you tend to get evolutionary, and it can be quite rapid, evolutionary adaptation. When you tend to get revolutionary innovation is when you get all 3 together. So new tactics, new organizational structure, new technologies, all coming together. And then someone at some point cracks the code on how to make that work, and it leads to an innovation spurt that everybody then starts copying. Yeah. And we've seen that with UAVs. I think, so one operation we haven't talked about is the Israeli attack on Hezbollah using the infiltration of the supply chain system for attacks on pages. Yeah. What got most of the attention was the use of small explosive charges in pages and that main attack. But actually it was a 4-stage operation, starting well before that with normal airstrikes on Hezbollah command and control nodes that were using cell phones. So basically they used a conventional operation to convince Hezbollah leadership to move off cell phones, going back a generation to pages. Then they infiltrated the pages supply system with doctored explosive pages. That was the second phase, leading to the explosions. The third phase was then attacks on the walkie-talkie system, right, which was all they had left, followed by conventional invasion of southern Lebanon and a heavy conventional air attack, right? So it's almost a cycle from conventional air attack to pages to strikes on radios to then back to conventional. So what you're seeing is basically an integrated multi-domain operation. May look impressive, it's really hard to do, right? Because you're talking about military, all 3 services, intelligence community, probably some criminal and non-state actors, plus diplomatic services, all getting involved, and probably commercial too, all getting involved into a single operation. How do you coordinate that? How do you do it in a way that your adversary doesn't detect it? Now, that's the sort of stuff that we're seeing a lot of innovation around that now.
Yeah, which perhaps brings me to the next question. Then I'll open up to the audience because I'm sure you all have lots of questions, hopefully. And by the way, if there are any questions from the virtual participants, feel free to either post them in the chat or I think posting them in the chat is actually the best option. So I think what you mentioned also points to a wider dynamic that we're seeing. Your second trend in particular, the undermining of trust in institutions, confidence in institutions and elites, but also more broadly speaking, the power dynamics. Do you think there is also, because of those dynamics, a pushback against democratic systems and actually where perhaps authoritarian systems who heavily rely on tech capabilities are the ultimate winners of these dynamics? Because then you control all of these stakeholders that you just mentioned in a way. Anne Applebaum also wrote a great book, Autocracy, Inc., which talked a little bit about the first trend as well, the collaboration between the different state actors, and also on a lower level between even private sector, military level cooperation between Iran, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, the state actors that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I am generally quite skeptical of arguments that claim that any opposition to incumbent governments must be generated by state adversaries. I think we've actually lost a lot more credibility than we needed to by blaming everybody that disagrees with us on Russian disinformation. And many times that this argument is used, if you look at the attribution that underlies the claim, it's either close to non-existent or circular, right? So we see a message that we don't like, we associate anyone that's putting out that message with the Russians, then we say, right, if we see that message, that must be the Russians, and we end up, just circularly reinforcing in a sort of schoolboy error that every junior intel analyst is told to avoid. And I think also by crying wolf multiple times about foreign intervention, we have desensitized the public to the point where they just don't believe it anymore. So I think that's a major problem that we need to think about. And that's an area of research and work that really needs to get a lot more effort, which is better attribution. I mean, many times you'll see a cyber attack attributed to an actor, and literally all there is that they appear, the APT group that's doing it appears to be working on Moscow working hours, right? And there's a bit of Cyrillic in the code. Like, that is not hard to fake, right? So I just think we have to be very careful about that. That said, that doesn't mean it's not a real issue. It is a real issue. And what you find is that state adversaries hide behind a cloud of unbelief that comes about because of the ongoing collapse of confidence and mutually reinforces it. One good example would be Russiagate in the US. After very extensive investigation that took 3 years, the US intelligence community decided that there was actually no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. That doesn't mean the Russians weren't trying to disrupt the election, they were, but for 3.5 years, the cable media in the US had harped on that issue so much that they had actually taken a fairly modestly funded and short duration GRU operation, Russian military intelligence operation, and extended its effect for another 3 years and had a much more significant impact on the cognitive space of the US population than it would have had if they'd just taken the same attitude we now take to terrorist shooters and avoid publicising their motivation. So I think there's a lot we can actually learn from the counterterrorism world when we come into this space. A lot more to say on that, but I don't want to take too much time from the discussion.
Yeah, I do want to open up to questions from the audience now. There will be a mic going around, or 2 mics. So please give me a hand sign if you want to ask a question. Yeah, here's one in the back.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the use of chemical and biological weapons by hyper-motivated, decentralized, non-state actors. Thank you.
Yeah, so historically, I think everyone caught the question, right? So individuals or groups attempting to use chemical or biological weapons. Historically, we did not see a lot of emphasis by terrorist groups on biological weapons, mainly because in the dynamics of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the level of impact, the psychological impact and the speed of effect of biological weapons was considered to be too slow. Lots of different groups, including Al-Qaeda and others, Japanese group, Shinrikyo, others looked into biological agents and chemical agents and either decided not to use them or in the Japanese case did use them with basically no effect. So many people moved away from that early in the war on terrorism. I think we are now starting to see some variation of that, but often enabled by cyber. So we saw a cyberkinetic attack on a water treatment plant in Florida a couple of years ago, where an individual hacked into the sewage treatment system in order to disrupt the control of different purification chemicals and jacked one of those chemicals up like 2000x to the point where it probably would have poisoned an entire town. It just so happened that a human operator was in the booth at the time and saw it happen and went, that's not right, and turned it back down. So it's a cyber attack to generate basically a chemical weapons effect. That would have been pretty quick to achieve. We've seen also state actors and some non-state groups starting to look at biological agents against crops and agriculture rather than human health. And I think that's going to be a growth area because it destroys economic production because you now can't export or import different commodities which can have a much more rapid lethal effect than simply creating a disease which people adapt to. I'd be remiss of me not to mention that there is still, of course, some debate about the origins of COVID-19. No allegation of non-state actor, but allegations that it may have been a lab leak from a state actor and designed to test systems that might then be attacked later. So yeah, I think So it's complicated. It's not a straight yes or a straight no, but it sort of is increasingly cyber-enabled, crops and agriculture, and I think we're going to see different forms of chemical attack potentially being reconsidered again by non-state actors.
Is there another question from the audience? Yeah, there are several. Let's start with the one in the back and then we'll go forward.
Thank you so much. From my understanding is that the evolution of global security is going to an insecure global situation that we're having. And as you said, because there's multipolarity of the globe, people, I think countries tend to now have the more of the urge to attack, to defend each other and others. I'm thinking of what would the political order look like after all this fighting that we have seen, like India and Pakistan, and now recently Iran and Israel, and all the Middle East crisis. What kind of global order can we see in a couple of years? Is it going to continue just fighting because there isn't any strong one power, two powers at least, and the multiplicity of it?
Yeah, great question. The short answer to that is we don't know, right? But we can think about it in a logical fashion and understand what's likely to happen. I don't think it's likely that any single power will again become dominant in a unipolar sense like we saw after the Cold War in the immediate future. Rather, what we will have is 3 or more distinct blocks, none of which is strong enough to fully overwhelm the others. And there's going to be a lot more space for, swing players at the middle power level within these areas. You might also see, use Australia as an example, you might also see middle powers they're not hedging their bets exactly, but like Australia's principal security partner is the United States. Australia's principal economic partner is China, right? That creates vulnerabilities, but it also creates opportunities. And we see this with South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, Turkey, a number of other middle power players. There is a fear, which you often hear in the United States, that China is seeking to supplant the United States and take over the world order. I don't see much evidence of that in Chinese discussion. I see more evidence that China wants to exclude the United States from the Western Pacific and be the dominant player over global supply chains, markets, and so on, but not to take on the global obligations that the US had for 30 years. Likewise, in Europe, I see a lot of fear that Russia will defeat Ukraine and then keep going and roll into Eastern Europe. I think that's extremely overblown. 18 months, 1.4 million deaths later, hundreds of billions of dollars, the Russians have gone from controlling 18% to controlling 21% of Ukrainian territory. So even if Ukraine were to collapse, the ability of Russia, let alone the desire of Russia to just roll into NATO is, I think, highly overstated. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but I think it's not something I would be betting money on. So I think where we end up with is something that, again, looks a bit more like the 1930s, except that instead of a series of imperial blocks, you have a series of more loosely aggregated blocks of countries that are maybe like-minded on some issues, but not all, that have some elements of sovereignty that they ascribe to the United Nations, but others that they hold within their own region, probably regional trading structures that are more mercantilist and more autarkic than we've seen in the past. So there's a tendency to say that environment will be a lot worse than the US-led unipolar world order. I would say that that's an attitude that you only get to have if you live in the West, right? Because the unipolar world order was not actually very good for most people on the planet, right? So I think it probably will be a bit worse for us. That doesn't necessarily mean that the global system will be less stable. That's a different question. So sorry, not really an answer, but just some thoughts that your question sparked.
There was another question here.
Yeah, hi. You talked a lot about this evolution in warfare that we're seeing, and I'm curious for your thoughts if Western militaries, like the British military, for instance, can keep pace with that, and if not, why not, and what would we need to do to, I guess, gain some parity with those adversaries?
So, great question. And I think the answer begins with the defence industrial base. So, we use a metaphor which I talk about in The Dragons and the Snakes called the fitness landscape, right? Which is just a metaphor, but it describes how different combinations of characteristics can be more advantageous to your survival, so more adaptive, or less advantageous, more likely to get you killed. And if you look at the last 30 years or so, and the kinds of features that we see emerging in the global system, they seem to be different groups hitting on more adaptive combinations of traits. And you can list them, right? I did earlier. Small, cheap, stealthy, fast, modular, easy to share, easy to maintain, good enough, not super exquisite. All those kinds of characteristics, swing role or multi-role, all those sorts of characteristics tend to be more survivable. Large, slow, overt, very expensive, exquisite, controlled so you can't transfer it to somebody else, slow to iterate, right? Now, obviously, if you look at Western militaries, we look a lot more, unfortunately, like the second list than the first list. That's not because our militaries lack innovative spirit or because we don't have commanders out on the ground that are trying to innovate. It's because you can only be as innovative as the defence industrial base allows you to be. And just one example, I had a conversation with a person from an American defence company talking about what's going on in the Black Sea, in the Red Sea, pointing out that we've got the Houthis launching $100,000 to $200,000 drones, our only response to which is a $5 million missile. And if you take, say, for example, a Type 23 frigate with a 32-cell vertical launch system, all the Houthis have to do is fire 33 missiles or 33 drones at that thing. It expends all of its air defence weapons and it has to leave, right? Because for commercial reasons, we bought VLS systems that can only be reloaded at port. Right? You can't be reloaded at sea. And this guy's response to me was, I said, that's really bad for the US Navy, right? And for the British Navy and everybody else who's got the same system. And he's like, yeah, it's pretty good for Raytheon though, right? Because every time you fire a $5 million missile, the customer has to buy a new one. So I think what we've actually got is a defence industrial base that is optimised for low intensity wars of choice against non-technologically equal adversaries a long way away. That's how you can get a weapon system like the Javelin, right? Javelin, which everybody loved at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, has two parts, the command launch unit and the missile, using American dollars here. The command launch unit costs $260,000. The missile itself costs $240,000. And the missile has 228 semiconductors in it. So I put it to you that you only build a missile that costs $250,000 and has 228 chips in it if you think you're only going to fire a few of them every year, right? And again, we've spent a lot of money on refurbishing that supply chain after the Ukrainians fired 7 years worth of production in the first 3 months of the war in Ukraine. When you find yourself in a war of necessity, not a war of choice, that's large scale, that requires major demands on the economy and on the population, and where you have to expand from a relatively small professional military to a mass military, I think you're starting to overstress all kinds of elements in the like the support structure that enables us to operate. That's where I think the critical reform has to take place. This may seem like a cop-out, but I don't see the problem as captains in the field, being too hidebound. It's not that. It's that you can only be as creative as your system allows you to be. And right now, that's not very. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Shall we take the one here first and then the one in the front row?
Thank you. How do you think a war over Taiwan will play out?
A very simple question. So I don't think it would necessarily be what people that buy equipment for the US Navy like to say it would be, which would be a conventional amphibious assault across the Taiwan Strait requiring lots of ships and missiles. That might be part of it, but I don't think that would be the whole of it. I think you would start with a cognitive domain attack, and we're already to somewhat some extent seeing that, trying to divide the Taiwanese leadership from each other, from the Taiwanese population, discourage other people from coming to the aid of Taiwan, play down the importance of a conflict over Taiwan, like is it really worth getting into a fight? You would see a lot of that happening in concert with grey zone activity in the Taiwan Strait, but also around the island of Taiwan, so blockade, close or distant, and movement within the strait. Again, you're seeing a lot of that already. You might see attacks on underwater fibre optic cables and on outlying islands of Taiwan. Again, we're already seeing that. If you saw an initial move, the middle ground might be special forces and paratroops dropping into Taiwan, seizing key locations, disrupting the command and control system, simultaneously missile strikes designed to decapitate the Taiwanese government, and then following up from that, a move against the mainland with an amphibious assault. Another way that you might see it might be a move against Jinmen or Matsu, the outlying islands that are only about a mile or two from the Chinese mainland. And you might see that in the form of a soft blockade with People's Liberation Army fishing militias or the Chinese Coast Guard or non-state actors, which would then trigger some kind of Taiwanese Coast Guard response, then escalating. And it would be sort of lame enough and vague enough that the information operation would be, is this really an invasion of Taiwan, and is it really worth fighting over this? And of course, if the West didn't move in response to that, then after that, any deterrent effect would be gone. Final one, and this is I don't think this is high likelihood, but it's worth considering as a possibility. If you're the PLA and you've decided to make a move on Taiwan, you know that the main defender of Taiwan is going to be Japan and the United States and Australia and the Philippines. It doesn't really make sense to just attack Taiwan and then sit back and await the inevitable response. It makes much more sense to start your attack in Iwakuni and Guam and Andersen Air Force Base and Okinawa and Darwin and maybe even Pearl Harbor, right, to disable a response. And you might do that conventionally, but you would have to anticipate that one possible adversary response to that would be nuclear. So it might even make sense for that initial strike to be tactical nuclear. So I'm not saying that's likely. I'm just saying that before we go down the route of a Taiwan invasion looks a lot like D-Day 2.0, maybe it does if you work for Raytheon and you don't want to buy a lot more anti-ship missiles, right? But maybe for those of us that do this for a living, it's worth thinking a bit more broadly on the possibilities. So sorry, long answer to a very short question.
Let's take the one in the front here.
Yes, could you expand a bit on the implications of your last two answers? It seems to be that if when we're allocating resources between different modes, Air Force, land forces, and so on, that really Navy, it seems to tick a lot of the wrong boxes in terms of slow, massively expensive, etc. Would you just shrink, particularly the surface Navy?
It's a great question. Luckily, I'm not in the position to make those decisions, but I'll use American and then British capability as an example. The most recent US commissioned Air Force aircraft carrier, the USS Ford, took 13 years to build and cost about $13.2 billion US dollars. The missiles in the Chinese arsenal that can knock out the Ford are the DF-21 and the DF-26. On average, the Chinese build a DF-21 or DF-26 missile every 10 days. By doctrine, we keep 2 to 3 carriers in the Pacific. So if you run the numbers and you look at how many Chinese launches there are, every carrier is going to take about 80 missiles directed against it in the event of a conquest. We could be building lots of General Belgranos, if you know what I mean, right? Where if you lose a small ship, it's a bad day out. If you lose your carrier, it's a national disaster and possibly knocks you out of the war. And I think there's a risk involved. And of course, we have, the UK has 2 carriers which between them absorb a very significant chunk of the future defence estimates and could be gone in the first 5 minutes of a conflict, right? So it's a question of where you want to carry that risk. And another example would be, you know, the Royal Marines Future Commando Force, or the Commando Force now, which I think is an incredibly innovative approach by a component of the Royal Navy, only works if you buy a minimum of 5 multi-role support ships, which I don't believe we're planning to buy now, right? So you've potentially turned an extraordinarily capable potential Royal Marine capability into a small brigade, right? So I think you've got to, it can't be an inter-service competition. It has to be a holistic look at what's going to be required in a given set of circumstances. And then not only what do we need to be there at the beginning of a conflict, but what's likely to still be usable after half the fleet's at the bottom of the South China Sea and you fired off all your high-tech missiles and the defence industrial base can't produce any more for you because they rely on rare earths and things that you have to get from your adversary, right? So I think a more modular, more irregular, more dynamic approach is probably right, but how that translates to individual platforms is more complicated. Sorry, so not really an answer, but yeah.
I'd like to ask a question in between because it's related to some of the questions asked previously, but would you say that, I'm taking the privilege here of being the chair and being able to ask a question, but would you say that the concentration of all these different technological capabilities, when you look at the state actors and non-state actors out there, are there specific players that you feel have a lot of these in a highly concentrated, we've talked about so many different capabilities and access to different technologies. Are there some state or non-state actors that stick out? You've mentioned China, of course, when it comes to cognitive domain operations. You've mentioned several other players when it comes to the use of drones or AI and cyberkinetic operations. Is there, which ones are the major players? And is there something that we, meaning the UK or perhaps European countries, should learn from them, or is that a dangerous game to play?
Well, it is a dangerous game, right? Anytime you try to learn from somebody else's experience, you have to really understand the circumstances under which those experiences were gained. The best after-action review that I've ever read in my whole career was the British Army's after-action review from the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And the reason it was the best is because the very first page says, stop. This operation happened under the following circumstances. If these circumstances don't apply to your operation, stop reading, right? Because what's in the rest of the document is not going to help you, right? And too often we just take whatever's in somebody else's lessons and go hunting for the thing that we want to hang our favourite hobby horse on, and then that's the lesson that we choose. So I think that's a very important thing. So it is dangerous, but I think I'll talk about Ukraine only because I spent a bit of time there. We have a lot to learn from the Ukrainians, with that caveat of making sure that it applies to our circumstances. I went out with a group during the big counteroffensive in 2023, and one of the Ukrainian commanders said to me, look, no offence, but the last time any Western army did what you guys are asking us to do was the British Army crossing the Rhine in February 1945. So if you guys happen to have a 100-year-old veteran from that battle kicking around, we'd be very interested in his opinion, right? But the rest of you guys have been fighting terrorists for 20 years, which is not what we're doing. Another example, without getting too tactical, when you train people in counter-battery fire, like how to survive counter-battery fire, we typically are working on the assumption that you're dealing with a mortar or gun locating radar, like the ANTPQ-36, which is the type we use. So you've got about 60 or 70 seconds before the fire comes back at you. And initially we were training the Ukrainians in that technique, and some of the gunners said to us, guys, please stop, because that's not how the Russians do it. They just fly a drone down the front line, and it's got a very simple algorithm. I see a flash, is it on our side of the line or the Ukrainian side of the line? And if it's on the Ukrainian side, it just dives on the target without even bothering to check what it is. So we don't have 60 to 70 seconds, we have like 5 seconds. So you're actually getting a lot of guys killed by training them in this old-fashioned way of thinking about counter-battery fire. So yeah, we have a huge amount to learn from them, but has to be filtered through their circumstances, which are going to be different to ours. We also have huge amounts to learn from adversaries. The Taliban, HTS in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, have all pioneered all sorts of interesting ways of combining commercial off-the-shelf with military off-the-shelf with homemade capabilities to generate capabilities out of all proportion to what we expected. And I think that's really important. Final point, and we can get into this in more detail if you want, but the most disturbing thing for me out of Israel's strike on Iran this last week, and it's pretty disturbing on many levels, but the most disturbing thing is that the Israelis are saying they did the strike because they believe that Iran is now within days to weeks of being able to put up to 9 nuclear warheads into the field. Only 3 months ago, Tulsi Gabbard, the head of the American intelligence community, said again the same thing that the US intelligence community has been saying for several years, which is that our best judgment is that the Iranians stopped trying to produce a nuclear weapon after 2003 and have not restarted that program. So one side's right and one side's wrong here, right? And if we are saying that the Iranians stopped and the Israelis are saying they're within days of achieving the outcome, that is a really major analytical difference. Some people will say, well, the Israelis are just lying because they have a political reason for dragging the US into a conflict with Iran. Maybe, but maybe we, for the most recent time out of many times, have gotten it completely wrong, right? So I'm, again, not wanting to contribute to the collapse of confidence in elites and experts. It's quite possible that our intel guys are as in the dark as the rest of us. So it's worth thinking about.
Let's take the question.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you very much for your talk. It's incredibly insightful. My question is on your fourth point, that on the operational level of war, the expansion of domains, etc. The narrative within the British Army at the moment and in the Strategic Defence Review published in the last couple of weeks is that the land domain is the decisive domain. To what extent do you agree with that statement? Is it a symptom of hubris? And would you argue that another domain is perhaps more decisive? Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologise because I haven't had time to read the new review yet. So these are tentative thoughts. So there's a sense in which you can say that the land domain is decisive, right? And that is because, you know, Homo sapiens is a terrestrial animal. You typically win wars by controlling the terrain where people live. If you want to control that terrain, you need to be able to establish presence. If you want to establish that presence and maintain it, you need to be able to prevail in close combat, and therefore the army, which is the service that prevails in close combat, becomes like the keystone on which everything else hangs. I think it's a bit of a long bow to draw to say that that makes the land domain decisive. It's actually quite a useful counterbalance to historical air power, you know, supremacists who've said that you can win the whole war with just enough strategic bombers, or the fleet guys who say, I just need 16 carrier battle groups and I don't need an army or an air force. So I think the truth is that all three services and the Space Force now and a very capable cyber force are needed to prevail, and a balanced force is probably more likely to be effective than one that emphasises one domain over another. But I do think that multi-domain operations increasingly are the driving element. Just to give you one example of an operation that I observed at first hand in Ukraine. So the one particular point in August of 2023, I was there when the Ukrainian Special Forces did a raid across the river, in the Dnieper River, purely in order to create a distraction, to shoot in a two-person team to the other side of the river to emplace an antenna so they could fly a drone on a tether to that location so that it could pick up off of an RF tag, targeting information, go strike a Russian satellite jammer about 5 miles in depth, which then took down the entire Russian GPS jamming system, allowing a conventional drone strike to go in and hit a Russian series of missile launch sites, right? So you had a Special Forces ground or riverine raid on the water to enable a distraction effect, to enable an electromagnetic spectrum manoeuvre, to enable a space-based cyber manoeuvre, to enable a physical airstrike on a long-range ground system, right? So real operations are not ground, air, or land. They're blends of all those things happening at the same time. And if you didn't have any one of those capabilities, you wouldn't have been able to do it. So I think we need a balanced force. That's probably not a force where a third or more of the budget is in 2 aircraft carriers, but it's probably also not a force that's a big territorial army and 3 divisions. So I think we have to, in some ways, shed our single service skin and think about what effects are we trying to achieve for how long, and work off of that basis. So again, not really an answer, but and I'm an army guy, as you know. I'd love it if I could say, yes, absolutely, the land domain is the decisive domain, but in reality, the way modern war goes down, it's not quite that simple.
David, thanks very much for coming and talking to us today. I'm glad you mentioned the significance of nuclear capabilities, because it's something that we are continuously reaffirming our investment and commitment in, but clearly it comes at a cost to investing in all the other things certainly highlighted through your 4 trends. Do you think that we are, in the current context, getting the balance right in putting our chips behind nuclear deterrent?
I do think a nuclear deterrent is critical. Come back to why I think that in a minute. But I think the government's action in the UK is partly driven by a concern that we may no longer have the option of relying on extended deterrence from the United States. And that's a common fear in Japan, Korea, Australia, EU. We've had the French talking about expanding their deterrence to the rest of the EU. Everyone's thinking about what do you do in an environment where you've basically structured your entire defence system around the assumption that the Americans will be there with a nuclear deterrent, and what if they're not there? So I think one luxury that the UK has right now is that that's not actually a problem for UK defence, because you have your own sovereign deterrent capability. There are a few other countries that have that. Obviously France is one. So I don't think it's wrong to have that nuclear deterrent. It becomes a question of balance because these capabilities are so expensive. I've been struck by what I think is the wrong-headedness of the discussion about possible nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. I don't think the Russians have been restrained in using nukes because they fear a Western response. I think it's basically because the prevailing wind direction blows back into Russia from Ukraine, right? And so if you set off a attack nuke, well, you're going to be doing a lot of damage to yourself. Many of the Russian nukes are extraordinarily small in terms of yield compared to ours. And if you use one of the calculators like NukeMap, there's a few out there, to run the numbers on a Russian small-scale tactical nuke being set off in a large Ukrainian city, the thing that you'll probably find quite surprising is how low the numbers are. We're talking about a few hundred casualties, not hundreds of thousands, but a few hundred. I think the real danger of somebody letting off a tactical nuke is not that it automatically results in an escalation to global thermonuclear exchange. I think it's that it destroys the taboo on use of nukes. The tac nuke goes off and everybody goes, oh, is that it? All right then. And then people just start lighting them off all over the place, right? And then it just becomes a species of big artillery, right, that everybody uses. And that fundamentally shifts the nuclear balance if that happens. I don't think there's no risk of global thermonuclear exchange, but I think it's relatively small. And wouldn't say manageable, but less than some of the other threats. So bottom line is I do think you probably have the balance about right. If I was going to take money out of the defence budget and move it around, which thank God is not my job, I probably wouldn't take it out of the nuclear deterrent. I'd probably take it out of something else.
I think we have time for one last question. I'm afraid we probably have to soon head to the drinks, to the reception, but hopefully you can continue the conversation over a drink. Let's take the question, sorry, I have to go for one of you in the back row, and hopefully the other conversations can happen.
We'll grab each other over drinks after.
Yeah. Or what we can do actually is let's combine the questions. Then we can take both.
Okay,
and
all right.
you can
For sure,
respond.
yeah.
I'll also make it quick. Professor, is something like having more people of a military background participate or contest in civilian politics something that you forecast or even potentially recommend for Western democracies to have the next prime minister or president be someone of a military background? Yeah.
Let's also take the question here and.
Yeah.
What do you think about the MOD's intention to triple lethality? Is it measurable or achievable? Does it mean anything at all?
And there was one more, so that's. Yep. I hope you remember all of them.
Yes, I just wonder how much effect there would be if one of the main players, Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, she died, was killed. How much is that going to change the situation?
Great question. So let me answer the first two questions pretty quickly, and the answers are no and no, right? So on the first question, there are very few people in Parliament in most Western countries or Congress that have any military background. That's a side effect of fighting small-scale professional expeditionary wars of choice, right, for 20 years, that don't actually intersect much with national interests, right? So there are exceptions. Finland, Estonia, right, where many, many people have served in the military and have that experience. But if you think about their circumstances, they're very different. They're defensive resilience problems, not expeditionary problems. So I think that it's not a given that it's better for democracy if you have more military people in the government. I actually think it's probably bad for democracy to have too many military people as heads of state or heads of government. But it really depends on which country you're talking about. Tripling lethality, meaningless metric, except from a public relations standpoint. It is almost as meaningless as the American replicator program, which is about flooding the zone with millions of small drones, right? Which is a great announceable, as we say, but doesn't really mean anything. I'm not opposed to increasing lethality, but how are you measuring it, right? Great point. So yeah. Now to the question about what if somebody dies. It sort of depends, right? And we're talking about Trump is what, 79 years old, Putin's 72 years old, Xi Jinping's 70. I don't know Khamenei's age, somebody may know, but he's up there as well. Netanyahu's the youngest of those, but also the shakiest in terms of his electoral coalition. So let's take Vladimir Putin for an example. Putin, I know this may be an unpopular point of view, Putin is actually a moderate in Russian politics compared to some of the other people out there. If Putin were to get hit by a truck tomorrow, the types of people that might take over, I won't name any, but there are people in the National Security Council, there are people in the Ministry of Emergency Situations and others who would be likely to be much more aggressive toward the West than Vladimir Putin has been, and even Peskov or Medvedev are likely to be more aggressive if you take their rhetoric as an indicator. Putin's a bit of a legalist, and he likes to have legal cover for everything that he does, even though what he does is often illicit, but he likes to have some kind of legal fig leaf. Not everybody in Russian politics is so delicate, right? So I think you would probably have more aggressive, but also perhaps more chaotic action from Russia without Vladimir Putin in charge. Xi Jinping, since October 2022, his Central Party school faction has been the dominant faction. There are other factions. There is a recent op-ed in the Chinese Army Daily complaining that the Chinese military has moved away from a collective consensus-based decision-making to single individuals, which is about as close as you can get to calling for Xi Jinping to back off if you're a Chinese general. As I said, after Admiral Mei Hua was dismissed late last year, we've seen what amounts to a purge of the senior ranks of the PLA. So that's ongoing now, up to about 1,500 colonels and generals getting purged. So if Xi Jinping was to get hit by a bus tomorrow, it's very unclear who would take over, and there would quite likely be a power struggle amongst different players. Donald Trump's a little bit more easy to predict. If Donald Trump fell dead, J.D. Vance would take over. He is not particularly popular in Europe. He's a lot younger than Trump. I don't see him as particularly radical. I do see him as quite inexperienced in terms of international affairs. So the likely power behind the throne would be people in defence or the intelligence community. The so-called deep state, which of course is a real thing, even though we've recently started pretending that it isn't. That would be a bit imponderable, right? Because who would be the key players? That would be quite hard to tell. So I think you'd have a more dynamic, more sort of expansive set of possibilities to worry about. I don't think it'd necessarily be more dangerous, but I think we would find more instability as a result of that. So yeah, again, great question and worth modelling, right? Worth thinking that through. In counterinsurgency, we have a saying, you should never kill anybody until you know who's going to replace them. And I think that stands for more than just counterinsurgency as well.
On this note, I hope we can continue the conversations, but thank you so much for joining us, both here in this room, but also virtually to the participants who joined us online, and especially a big round of applause to Professor David Kilcullen for joining us and for this brilliant intervention.
Thanks, Julian. Great job moderating too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.